And we're live. Welcome everybody here to the Lakers Lounge. I'm Anthony Irwin, joined today on the show for the first time. It has taken way too long for this first time for this person to be on the show with us. Michael Scotto of HoopsHype. You can follow him on Twitter at Mike A. Scotto. He is one of the most dogged reporters and underrated reporters, I think, out there. He is great with scoops. He is great with information. He absolutely works his ass off. Finally got to meet him last summer in Vegas. We said we were going to do this. So here we are, Mike. Thank you very much for hopping on with us.
Oh, my pleasure, Anthony. Thanks for the kind words. I appreciate it. And, I'll go with sources confirm on that one.
It's man, look, I having just dipped I joked with this with Jake on last week's show, how I've kind of dipped my toe into the reporting waters. And that is a lot of work, man, having to stay on top of stuff and having to advance the story and stay with the story as it advances. It is a difficult task and one that you do quite well, my friend. So thank you very much for hopping on here. Sure. And absolutely thrilled to get to it. We have a lot to get to, right? We have the deadline that has already seen a few trades take place. As of late, we've seen some of that noise die down a little bit. We'll tap into a little of why that might be going on. The Lakers, got close to a Dejounte Murray trade, but apparently those talks have stalled. So we'll see if we can get the latest on that. And if Murray doesn't happen, or if Murray does happen, I think the Lakers still have quite a bit of work to do this deadline. So we're going to discuss what that work would look like as well. But I wanted to start here. I tweeted this out the other day, and in kind of talking to some people around the league and some other teams that are, looking to buy here at the deadline, because there are so few sellers, and because there are, and because a lot of teams really feel like they are a piece or two away from really contending for a championship. I think those sellers are trying to take advantage of the situation, rightfully so. And the asking prices on a lot of guys is through the roof, right? You have, as an example, Bojan Bogdanovic. There's talk that if the Lakers were to get in on Bojan, it was going to cost Austin Reeves. And it's like, excuse me, Tyus Jones is supposed to fetch a first rounder. Is this, would you say, like the norm? Would you say, we are still about 10 days or so out from the trade deadline. Would you say prices are higher than they normally are this time of year? Or would you say this is right around where you would kind of expect it as these teams posture for a really critical trade deadline?
What's interesting, when you talk to executives, they'll tell you the market went down a little bit and it almost reset compared to the Rudy Gobert trade. That had a lot. And that's why Dejounte Murray, quite frankly, went for all the first round picks that he did previously when Atlanta got him. And it's now ironic that he's a guy that they're open to moving before the deadline. And certainly the Lakers have come up for him. But, you bring up a good point, Anthony, about the market, that there are a lot more buyers than sellers. And I don't know if that's because, we have the play-in tournament or things along those lines. But, it's interesting. In past, I'm just going back randomly here, but like, for example, when Orlando kind of rebuilt and decided, all right, we're going to get rid of Vucevic, Gordon, Fournier, those executives were able to get contract extensions at the time and really sell ownership on a rebuild. And I think sometimes that's half the battle. Like you see in Detroit, a team that struggled for a while now, ownership is kind of like, well, when are we going to get this thing going here? When are we going to get better? And you also look at this draft class, it's not nearly as vaunted as last year's draft class with some of the top names. I think there's maybe depth here and you can get guys at certain positions, but do you have like a franchise caliber guy, a perennial all-star? There's more to be desired here. So that's affecting things as well. And so again, big picture wise, I think that's got a lot to do with why it's made the trade market more niched, and certain teams are reluctant to be a seller. You also got to look at the Brooklyn Nets and see what are they going to do. They have a bunch of guys that could be moved, and Royce O'Neal, Dorian Finney-Smith, Spencer Dinwiddie. And so, that team hasn't been where it thought that it would be at this point, but now Ben Simmons comes back, and we'll have to see how that changes the equation. So you've got all these variables right now. And as you touched on, a lot of trades have happened already, which, the Pascal Siakam trade most recently, and Indiana still has more work to do. They have a glut of forwards on that roster now. I look at Obi Toppin, Jalen Smith, Jarris Walker. You can't play all those guys behind Pascal Siakam. Mm-hmm. So, maybe not in the immediate future. It's one of two things, Anthony. This is what I'll leave you with on this wide-ranging answer to your question. For some teams, it's about looking towards the luxury tax looking ahead. They may not be hitting it now, but by the summer when the new, CBA rules kick in and things get a little harder, the thinking is, well, maybe we have to do something now before those rules make it harder to kind of clean up our books a little bit. And essentially for a lot of teams, I should say most, I shouldn't say all, but for a lot of teams, that second apron is essentially a hard cap. They're acting like it, even though it's not. So you got all those factors, affecting the trade deadline right now.
Yeah, I remember that at the deadline, that was essentially the consensus for all but maybe 3 teams, right? Golden State blew right through that second apron. The Phoenix Suns looked like they were going to blow right through it, but then right at the last second, kind of like held on to the cliff a little bit and still are over it, but not as far beyond it as we thought they might go. I think Milwaukee also blew through it as well. And yeah, I remember, kind of talking to some folks back then, and that was the consensus. It was like, yeah, we all kind of sort of have some walking orders here. We got to get underneath the second apron here and stay there moving forward, period. And I think that is a great thing to point out here as well. I also think teams are nervous about that, the salary floor rules. And I think a lot of these teams are like, well, shoot, we know who we have in this veteran. We like this veteran here. This guy goes along with our culture, is perfectly fine being a mentor to our young guys. I think that's kind of why you're seeing how Detroit is holding on to Bojan, right? Where normally this guy would have been traded last year, but his asking price is still crazy high. And I think they're kind of like, well, we're going to have to hit that salary floor regardless. We know what we have here. We don't know how a different veteran or a different outsized contract would look like or fare in our culture here. Yeah. And how they would handle this as well. So that the CBA in general, I think, is playing a real factor, a real role in how all this is playing out.
And they turned down 2 first-round picks from a contender last year. So the price is going to remain high. You're not going to want to move off that if you're Detroit. And so with that in mind, it's like, well, there were obviously those talks at a certain point about, well, do they get Zach LaVine? And it's like, well, if you're going to get a guy like Zach that makes that much money, you got to send a lot of money out, given where both teams are, to an extent. I mean, Detroit, I guess, doesn't have to if they don't want, because they got, future cap space looking ahead. But still, Bojan's a guy like a lot of teams want and could help a playoff team if he ended up going there. But all these different dominoes come into effect. And, for the Lakers, I know you touched on like maybe them if they would get in it. I think it'd be a little too rich for their blood at this point.
It's crazy. The Bojan Bogdanovic on an expiring deal is too rich for blood. It's crazy.
But the thing about Bojan, though, is like, to your point, like it isn't expired. Well, I think he has, it
might be another year.
It's not. He's got another year after that, but I think it's partial guaranteed. But a team would easily, in my opinion, if you're picking him up, you're unofficially winking and going to guarantee that for him because it's a team control option because it's non-guaranteed money, and the team has the decision. But for Bojan,
it's only $2 million guaranteed next year.
Yeah, but I mean, you're going to keep him at that price. I don't see why. I would say, for the Lakers, they've been in a lot of talks, and we might as well start with Dejounte Murray, certainly the big elephant in the room for Los Angeles. As I had touched on HoopsHype, they were looking for really a third team at a certain point that would take D'Angelo Russell. And ironically, in the midst of that, D'Angelo Russell goes on a tear. And I would say to you, Anthony, I certainly don't think D'Angelo Russell wants to get traded. I want to put that out there.
Mm.
He's not playing like a guy that wants to get moved. I'll tell you that. And this is essentially what you would need out of a third guy for the Lakers anyway, behind LeBron and AD. So, when the talks were going on, the bigger question was, does a team like Washington, Charlotte, teams that are openly out on the market telling teams, hey, we'll take on future money if you've got future draft picks for us. But at this point, the Lakers would be given a pick and potentially Jalen Hood-Schifino to either the Hawks or rerouted somewhere else in a 3-team deal if that were to happen eventually with Dejounte. So they're not going to want to give extra draft capital to get off D'Angelo. The Hawks aren't going to want to do that,
Yeah.
So ultimately, I think, those talks have, I would say, lessened a little bit. And so now, while the noise around Dejounte with the Lakers has quieted a little bit, you still got 10 days before the deadline. There's still plenty of talks to be had. So I wouldn't rule anything out just yet. I think that's early. I do know I had Jovan Buha on the HoopsHype podcast, and we were talking about Zach LaVine. I would say that's more unlikely at this point. But, there's other guys they've been linked to, Tyus Jones. But if you're going to keep D'Angelo, I don't really see the vantage point there of going for Tyus, especially when Washington wants a first-round pick, as I've reported for him. Other guys like Dorian Finney-Smith, role players, you're not going to give up the asking price for him. Some teams have told me they think it would take, the equivalent of 2 firsts or a first-round pick and a rotation guy for Dorian Finney-Smith. I don't think, that would behoove a team like the Lakers right now. They don't have a surplus of that. And the other thing is, when you look at them in general, okay, you've got really D'Angelo Russell, maybe Rui Hachimura, and you got the future pick down the line in 2029. And if you trade Rui, well, okay, now you got a front court deficit as your third scorer off the bench. If you move D'Angelo, well, you better be getting a point guard back. Yep. That's going to be a table setter for you. And I know you can play LeBron at the 1, but a guy that's going to knock down and hit shots, I'm pretty sure D'Angelo is shooting over 40% now from 3. It's pretty good. Austin Reeves, they don't really want to touch. I think it would take, theoretically, an all-star caliber guy that's in his prime now in a bigger package that would have to involve Austin Reeves. They love him. He's on a cheaper deal, which matters for them, as we've touched on, given the new CBA rules. You need to have guys like that. The quote unquote, I don't know, the big threes, or the Miami big three, like when the Warriors had, all these guys in the prime of their career. That's harder to do now with the new CBA. Or if you do, you're sacrificing your bench. And we saw last year when the Lakers made the move and they got D'Angelo, well, that was better for them. They had more depth when Russell Westbrook was gone at that point. So all these things to factor and keep in mind when you look at the Lakers right now going into the deadline coming up in 10 days, a little less or so.
Could we I want to go back a second and talk about the D'Angelo Russell situation, because this is something I always find kind of fascinating, in that the larger data sample here would indicate that the Lakers don't necessarily trust D'Angelo Russell in the postseason. That D'Lo maybe shouldn't really be trusted in the postseason, because with every team that he's played on, he got benched in the postseason, whether it was Brooklyn and then Minnesota, and then most recently last season against the Nuggets. And how do teams, or how, in this case, how have you gotten the sense with D'Lo on how the Lakers are weighing the way that he has played these last couple weeks versus what we've seen over the course of his career? Can a couple weeks of solid play override everything that because heading into this deadline, it was not even really a question. He was going to probably be moved. Has 2 weeks of good basketball changed their minds on that?
Big picture, it has a small impact. I don't think it's an overbearing one. But the bottom line, regardless, was if you were going to have to get another pick involved to get off D'Angelo's salary as well with a third team, That's where it becomes tough.
Yeah.
The original version where you have, D'Lo going and you've got the 2029 first and Jalen Hood-Schifino, which they're marketing as, well, that would be the second round pick you guys are, kind of looking for. Well, the Hawks didn't take him. They took Kobe Buffkin, and they don't want D'Angelo. So to get that third team involved, you'd probably have to give up another asset to get off D'Lo. And if a team and when I say that, if you're Charlotte or Washington, you're not trying to be necessarily good next year or a playoff caliber contending team. So it doesn't matter. It's all about future assets. So you'd have to be giving up more for that. And that's where it's well, for the Lakers, is it worth it to do that? Because they do like Dejounte Murray, and what his numbers are going to be going forward. D'Angelo's got a player option. You would assume he would opt into that as of now, given the way the trade market is kind of unfolded. But then after that, you got to see what the future holds. And so Dejounte, what you would be getting, even if he got the trade kicker involved and things like that. They seemed like they'd be open to doing that. And when he is right, he does play defense. I know in Atlanta they haven't played defense now, but I think that's a microcosm of being around, respectfully, Trae Young.
It's tough. Yeah.
When your top player is not a defensive guy, it's fallen by the wayside for the rest of the guys like Dejounte Murray and Clint Capella. So overall, it certainly helps D'Angelo's case to stay, but how far does it swing the pendulum? Slightly, but not overly.
Yeah, it's a great point that you mentioned. Rob Pelinka did not want to move an extra first rounder to trade Russell Westbrook 2 seasons ago. And then when he finally did trade Russ, it was Russ and 1 first rounder, essentially, with some other stuff that went out the door as well, to go out and not just move Russ, but also bring in help, right? It used to, all of last season, the thought was that it was going to cost a pick to move Russell Westbrook and another pick to bring in the help necessary to make your team any good. And I could see it is kind of consistent with Rob Pelinka's kind of track record here that he would, be okay in moving D'Lo in a deal to Atlanta. But then as soon as it kind of comes out, well, it's going to cost a pick just to move D'Lo. I could see him kind of bumping on that notion as well. If they do decide to keep D'Angelo Russell, I do still think they need help. It's not a perfect roster. There just isn't very much two-way help on this Lakers team. They haven't gotten anything from Gabe Vincent this year. There are some reports, I believe it might have come up with you and Jovan, I forget, but there's so much information out there right now. But there is some thought out there that Gabe Vincent is considered a negative asset. I haven't heard as much of that because it's a small contract. It's not even the full mid-level. And it's only 2 years after that.
I could definitely touch on that. Yeah, I definitely.
Okay, yeah.
I'd put that. Yeah, around the league, put it this way, nobody's taking him player for player. You'd have to give up an asset to get off.
Wow. Okay.
That's not. He hasn't shown anything right now. Yeah. And the other thing is this, Anthony. At the end of the day, Miami Heat role players are just around the league. Maybe with the exception of Max Strus this year, fair or not, are considered Heat culture guys, and they fit that system. And Gabe is eventually going to have time to come back and show if he can do well outside of Miami. But ultimately,
he doesn't look good.
There's a stigma against those guys when they leave Miami. There just is. You talk to enough executives, I would say more than half would say that. And so that's where what am I trying to say? His trade value comes in that point where it's viewed as a negative asset. He hasn't done anything on the court. He hasn't stayed healthy. And you look ahead towards that contract, it's like, you're right. Maybe it's not full mid-level or anything like that, but is it even worth it to have right now when you could use that money elsewhere? And for certain teams, things are tight. No, again, that's why it comes down to you would have to give up potentially something to move off him, or you're putting him in a bigger package with somebody that's really coveted to offset it. So you don't have to give up an asset. It's like, well, you need this money to maybe make it work, or we're giving you a guy that's so good that you got to look at it. And I don't think that's the case. You can't put him with like D'Angelo Russell or Rui Hachimura and say that. Now, theoretically, if they did something like that with Austin Reeves, maybe that's a different conversation. But again, they don't want to move him, so squash that.
Yeah, essentially, it had been kind of contradictory, and certainly Lakers people would like you to believe it isn't a negative asset. So I guess that's worth mentioning as well. I do kind of wonder though, like, all right, so they aren't inclined to move Russell because of the way that he's played the last couple of weeks, and because it might take another pick to move him. Not a great market on Gabe Vincent. Rui's market is kind of hard to gauge because Darvin hasn't given him a particularly consistent role this year. Can't trade Jared Vanderbilt because of his contract extension. So you start to look at this and you're like, well, what avenues are they going to take here to improve? And on top of that, if they keep losing, is there a point that the front office just kind of says that's too much work for just one trade deadline?
Yeah, I mean, I know, like, I'll say this, some Laker fans have asked about just either in mentions or, you know, when I had Jovan on the pod, like, well, what about Darvin? What about Darvin Ham? Would they consider anything there if they don't make a change? And it's like, I haven't heard anything of that yet. You know, Jovan didn't either. Jovan said on the pod he thinks he makes it through the season. Now, of course, you know, if the Lakers go on a 7-game, 10-game slide, all bets are off. But you wouldn't think that would happen anyway. So right now, they're going to have to weather the storm. And again, a player like Dejounte Murray, the thought is, well, maybe that's worth it. That's a guy that they felt was worth it to give up that future first and you know, D-Lo at a certain point. But, you know, again, it takes two to tango for the Hawks. They don't want to take back salaries. I've touched on if they're going to move Dejounte Murray, they want to try to kind of clear their books a little bit and avoid potential luxury tax issues next year. They don't have to worry about it now. And this is the other thing, Anthony. You know, our good friend, our mutual friend Yossi Goslin, who kind of put us together, who, by the way, just had a baby. Very happy for him.
Yeah.
And so for Yossi, we were talking about the Hawks situation. And we both looked at it on paper and we said, well, they don't have to, like, you know, gun to the head, you don't have to trade Dejounte Murray. You're not worrying about the luxury tax now, but it's the big picture stuff down the line. So if you're going to get 50 to maybe at best 75 cents on the dollar, is it worth it? That's something Atlanta's got away right now. And so time will tell within the next 10 days where that price barometer leans, whether it's that he's staying or going. But, I mean, certainly he's – the other thing I don't think people talk about, I think he has a little bit of a trade kicker too as well. If you do trade for him, you're going to be paying a little bit more on the back end. So all these factors to consider coming up over the next week plus.
What is the likelihood then, do you think, that the Lakers do wind up doing something here at the deadline? I feel like it's you know, fairly likely that they do something, but you know, given the picture that you've painted to this point, it sounds like they really have their work cut out ahead of them.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think right now the talk on Dejounte Murray has quieted a little bit. You know, Zach LaVine really deafeningly quiet. Some would say silent. And so, you know, I mean, we'll see if Chicago changed their stance with a week plus, but I don't see that at this point, at least with the Lakers. And so do they make a move around the edges to get better? Maybe. But, you know, I still think they have the most interest in Dejounte Murray of wanting him. I just don't know if they're going to be able to find a third team. It's the way I've always said it is, you know, for the Lakers in general with D'Angelo, there wasn't a situation where they could just move him that made sense for just two teams, a one-for-one team kind of deal. So they had to get a third team. And I would say if you have to do that, well, then how are you going to find the third team that takes him? You have to then hope teams that are like lottery-bound teams, whether it's Detroit, San Antonio, Charlotte, Washington. You know, I know people asked me about Brooklyn as well, if they would take him back. I hadn't gotten that sense that anything was imminent for him going there. But you've got to weigh all these teams and see if you can get it done. It's just a lot of work to get a guy in Dejounte. And again, I don't think it totally like changed the entire trade perspective, but D'Angelo's played well. So if you can get this production going forward, you know, is it really worth it?
Yeah. I have a hard time gambling on this kind of production from D'Angelo Russell moving forward. Like that's kind of difficult. I think the Lakers kind of feel that way too. So it is going to be interesting to watch this all play out. I do feel like we've gotten quite a bit of posturing here from both sides as you know, there's all this, well, we really like D'Angelo stuff, and then, you know, from Atlanta's perspective, well, you got to find a third team because we don't really want them, and so we'll kind of see how this all plays out, and if we want to pay close attention to this, legitimately one of the absolute best in this business to help you stay you know, up to date on all of the stuff is by following Mike on Twitter at Mike A. Scotto. You can find his work at HoopsHype. He's a great follow, ton of great information that is just constantly flowing from that account. So thank you very much, Mike, for hopping on. And I look forward to either talking to you here soon again or seeing you there in Vegas over the summer.
I look forward to both. Yeah, I'll be there, and I'm looking forward to Vegas. You know, next big trips coming up. We've got, you know, pre-draft combine and stuff. Looking forward to that. Chicago, definitely Vegas Summer League. It's going to be, I've heard it's going to be a little later this year. So we might be hitting 115-degree weather in Vegas. So stay tuned for that.
Great. Fantastic.
But either way, looking forward to seeing you, brother, and my pleasure hopping on. Thank you for the kind words.
Hey, thank you very much for hopping on. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Again, follow him on Twitter at Mike A. Scotto, and keep an eye out for some more shows here. Well, the Lakers play tonight, so I'll be live here in the lounge after the game tonight. So until then, until the next time you guys hear from me, I'm Anthony Irwin saying have a great rest of your day, make somebody else's, and I'll talk to you in a few hours or so.